Welcome to the SBIR Tips and Tricks event. As Washington University's Hub of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the Lahue Center for Interdisciplinary Innovation and Entrepreneurship is committed to providing a collaborative and welcoming event experience. To ensure this, we ask that you actively and respectfully engage everyone participating. Facilitate networking and connections. Please introduce yourself in the chat and share your LinkedIn profile if you wish. We're excited to host this event to introduce technology startups on how they might fund R&D through small business innovation research grants. I'm Cyril Loom, the Assistant Director of Venture Development for the Lahue Center. Today's presenter is Ed Lahue. Ed is the Innovation and Technology Counselor for the University of Missouri Extension, where he supports the Missouri Small Business Development Center in St. Louis. Ed, I will now hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Joe. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen okay? Okay, great. Well, what we're gonna do, we're gonna take about 20, 30 minutes presentation, and then we have plenty of time, about 30 minutes for Q&A following. As Cyril said, my name is Ed Lahue. I'm the Innovation and Technology Counselor with the University of Missouri Extension, and we host the Missouri Small Business Development Center. I'm located in St. Louis. We have about 5 counselors, similar to what I do across the state. We focus on really 3 areas: customer discovery, market research, and small business innovation research grants. So what I'm going to do today is focus really on SBIR. You'll hear me say SBIR, but really it's SBIR or STTR, but that's too long to say. So we kind of abbreviate that, which is SBIR. So what is this about? Well, it's a $4.28 billion federal funding program mandated by legislation back in 1982. And really it's about increasing and supporting scientific excellence and technology through investment with federal funds. So SBIR is the Small Business Innovation Research versus STTR is Small Business Technology Transfer. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute what the difference is. But overall, this is really about stimulating new technology and innovation, but also developing products for commercial merit, and ideally also social good. So the ultimate here is to really create jobs. So this isn't just about science technology, it's about how do we take innovative science technology and create jobs through commercialization. So I love this graph. It's really kind of illustrates how this is a mechanism to fund the best early stage, high risk innovation out there. Really typically too high risk for private sector. So if you, on the left here, you see basic science already gets a lot of this funding on the sort of the government funding side. This is really around where prior to angel or any other private investing, you would use this to fund your startup essentially. If it's got an innovation, it has to be innovative, not just revolutionary. It has to be totally different, totally new. And then the idea is that this kind of bridges that gap between before you can actually go get angel or venture capital. So here's some of the startups that have actually started this way. You probably recognize many of these names, but they started with funding from an SBIR. So what's the difference between SBIR and STTR? Well, really the main difference is how you partner. SBIR permits you to partner, or STTR requires you to partner. So I know many of you are employed by WashU. So WashU would be an example of a research institute. So you can also do this with not only other universities, but the USDA. You could do other creatives with other labs. But it's not all agencies offer both of these options. On the SBIR, the principal investigator has to be employed with the small business. So if your principal investigator is a professor, the professor would have to take a sabbatical under the SBIR side. But if you're going after an STTR, that professor could do that work as the PI and could be employed by either the research institute, in this case WashU, or by the small business. But it does vary by agency. So you'd have to kind of check that solicitation. On the SBIR side, you can subcontract up to 33%, but you're not required. But on the STTR, at least 30% of this has to go to the research institute. This could be hiring grad students, it could be renting a lab, it could be all those other things, but it has to be part of the grant would then have to go to the university in that scenario, or a research lab. Typically, most of the dollars are more on the SBIR side. As you can see, 3.2% versus the STTR. And again, not all agencies allow the STTR, where the SBIR is allowed by most agencies. So there's basically 16 agencies, 11 of them do both, and 5 do only STTRs. So here's a simple way to describe this. If you look at the blue ones are agencies that only do SBIRs. The green ones are agencies that do both SBIR or STTR. And then I'm gonna hide this, there we go. So here's the fiscal 21 budget, 4.282 million. To give you some idea of the magnitude, half of this is Department of Defense, 2.29. Health and Human Services, which NIH is the largest one there, is the other big chunk of 1.2 billion. And then you can see the other agencies, Department of Energy, National Science Foundation is another popular one. And then you get into some of the smaller agencies that give very small grants, like the EPA or Department of Transportation. So how does this work in terms of the phases and the funding? So some of you may have heard of different phases. Well, phase 1 is really around concept development. So this is really, you're trying to kind of prove the concept. You're not really quite ready for a prototype, but you're trying to define a technical hurdle, and you're trying to show that you can prove that you can actually overcome that hurdle. This is typically you get up to a year, but you can do it as short as 6 months. And it varies from 50,000 up to National Science Foundation just raised their phase 1 to 275,000. And then on phase 2, this is a 2-year, and then you have to complete the phase 1 in order to comply to phase 2. So phase 2 would be more around prototype development. Maybe it's a larger scale. If it's NIH, you now maybe getting into human clinical trials. This is anywhere from $500,000 to NIH just raised their phase 2 up to a maximum of 1.7 million. And phase 3 is a little bit of a misnomer. It's not really a phase 3. It's really, the idea is that you now then go out and get commercial funding. It's not really SBIR funding. If you're doing a DOD is actually a contract. DOD what they call a phase 3 would be, they'd actually give you a contract to buy the product. So for instance, you might have build a part for a plane, and they need that part. So they're gonna fund your phase 1, your phase 2, and then their phase 3 would be a contract buying that part. But typically, most of these agencies like NIH, NSF are not going to be buying anything from you. They're just granting you those awards to do the development. So that's why that phase 3 is can be a little bit confusing, a little bit of a misnomer. So why consider SBIR or STTR? Well, as we talked about, it fills that gap between new startup with no capital to build a prototype. You don't have an investable business yet. You just have a concept. You have no product, no revenue. So typically the way we think about this when we counsel people around getting investors is your first option is, you bootstrap it, maybe family, fools, and friends. Then hopefully an SBIR if it's worthy of that. Then you get a prototype. Then you go after angels. Then you go after venture capital. Then you go after Series A. So it's that order. So you're not going to go after those venture capitals until you actually have a prototype and already proven the concept, get the angel just to get started. But you have to have revenue in order to get those other investors later. So it's non-dilutive capital. It's the largest source of non-dilutive. So I hate to call it free because it's taxpayer money, but it's free money to you. And the other cool thing is this award validates technology prior to investor. So if you do get an SBIR or STTR, later downstream as you develop your prototype, this shows a lot of credibility that your technology has been vetted, particularly by someone like National Science Foundation or National Institute of Health. But it also enables early transfer technology from academia to startup. So many of you may be working with your tech transfer office where there's already a patent that WashU owns that you can use that patent and do further research on it, particularly through either to, well, you could be SBIR or STTR. It attracts commercialization partners and funding once you do show that you've been vetted. The other cool thing is small business retains ownership of the intellectual property. There's a few exceptions to this, but for the most part, the government, what it says is, I've got a link there and you'll get this deck, is the government basically can come back to you and say, this has actually never been done, but the government does have the right to come back to you and say, we want to license this for free from you. But we've never had a case of someone doing that. But that's basically written in that, in the regulations, if you would. And also the government can't share reports on data with you, anyone outside the federal government, for 20 years. What they do is if you are awarded, you do have to agree to, there's a abstract of your concept and your contact information, but everything else is held confidential. So what is SBIR? Well, S is for small. So small meaning you can't have more than 500 employees, and 51% must be owned and controlled by you. The business has to be a for-profit. So if you're a nonprofit, this does not qualify you. Doesn't matter if you're sole proprietor, partnership, LLC, corporate C corporation. It has to have innovation. This is probably the most critical thing. It must be innovative. It must be breakthrough technology. It needs to be more revolution than evolution. One of the analogies that NSF uses is, hey, if you said, hey, I got a way to go to the moon, they'd say, it's been done. But if you want to go to Mars, now we're talking. Or another way to think about it, if you know the St. Louis, in St. Louis, there's several bridges going across the Mississippi River. So if I came to you and said, hey, I've got a way to build a bridge, you'd look at me like I'm crazy, like, well, they've already got bridges. But if I told you I'm going to build a bridge to Hawaii, all of a sudden that's going to take new thinking, new science, or new technology to develop that. Or you could take existing technology and apply it in a very novel way. LASIK was one of the winners of a SBIR, where they took a beam that's used, a light beam, and did eye surgery with it. So you can think about it, when that was first suggested, that probably sounded a little crazy. So it has to be that cutting edge breakthrough. You might be saying, well, no, but Ed, I've got this idea. It's really unique to the marketplace. Well, that's fine. You need both. You need to be unique to the marketplace, but also be able to show that you're doing breakthrough technology, breakthrough science. And it has to be research. So this is about establishing technical and scientific merit and feasibility of your proposed research. So this has to be a research project. This can't be market research. This can't be, I just need money because I got to make payroll for my startup. This has to be defined in a way that is going to have certain requirements, very similar to what you probably do with other grants. And those requirements dictate how the grant's going to get paid out. So who qualifies? We already talked about you got to be a small business, you have to be for profit, you have to be US owned and controlled. More than 50% has to be owned by US citizens or permanent residents. And I already talked about under 500 employees, located in the US. And all the R&D project has to be done in the US. And it has to be done in a controlled research space for the grant project. So if you're doing, you at least have to have keys. So if you're going to use a lab, you got to have access to the lab. You don't have to own the lab. You can lease the lab. If you're going to do an STTR with the university, obviously that's fine because the university owns the lab, but you can't do this in your basement. One of the things that we always have startups that say, I got this really cool idea. I've been working down in my basement, tinkering. They're not going to fund that. So what's involved? Well, we already kind of touched on this. Number one thing is an innovative, novel concept that matches a research topic with one of the federal agencies. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the National Science Foundation, where they have very nice broad topics, which is no problem finding a topic there. But all the other agencies, you really have to match up with what the research. So every agency has specific aims that they're trying to do. They have a mission. So for instance, National Institute of Health, which many of you may be familiar with, obviously they're trying to improve overall health and access to health. So your concept has to, your concept, your research has to fit in one of those topics. And those topics will change from year to year. And you have to have a good standing of the current state and how your technology pushes beyond that current state. So one of the first things that, if you're not familiar with this, is figure out what other experts are out there working on this. And if they published, you can look at things like Google Scholar, and I know you all have access to other databases to see who else is working on some of these things and have some different theories around this, to be able to articulate that current state and show this is what the current state can't seem to get over. And I want to prove in my concept, in my phase one, that I can overcome that. And I think to be able to articulate that is really important. A research plan that demonstrates how you're going to prove that. So you're going to talk about, these are my specific objectives that I'm going to do, and this is the budget I need in order to do that work. Identification of project team members who can carry out this research plan. So I know a lot of you are experts in your field. You need to make sure that you've got also maybe potentially other experts that are critical to that research plan. So if you're going to work on, let's say, a medical device, but you're using AI, well, yeah, you might understand medical devices and maybe the medical aspect of this, but you need to have somebody that really understands artificial intelligence and maybe how to do algorithms or whatever. And the team has to be able to be well-rounded and have that, and really be able to show that they've done other research in that area in order to hand you over $275,000 of taxpayer money. So the other critical part that a lot of people struggle with is a market estimate and who's the customer. We do a lot of teaching, and I know you all offer also courses there on business model canvas and value proposition, but understanding this, the term that most of these agencies, they use is significance. Is this worth investing in as a taxpayer? And ideally they'd love to have social good. But this is where many folks really break down. They've got a cool idea, great science, great technology, but don't really know if they've got a home for this. So this involves customer discovery, looking at secondary market research, trying to estimate that market so that when you apply for the grant, you're telling them, if I produce this concept, I will then move to phase two. I will then develop my prototype, and I know who my customer is as I'm developing this. Back in the 80s, when SBIR first was launched, I think it was Department of Energy did within 5 years of the program, they said, hey, how are we doing? What companies have launched from all these SBIR fundings? And they found that about 80% of them never went to market. And that was during that time is when they made a really hard change on saying, this is about commercialization. So in addition to you showing me that you've got a legitimate research plan, you have to show me that you've got a market for this product. Many of these products they had developed the phase one and then never launched it, because then they finally went out and did the customer discovery and found out there were no customers for it. So we don't want to develop something in the research lab and there's no home for it. Time and effort. If you're a first-time submitter, we estimate it's going to take you about 150 hours over a 10-week period. Now, you're not going to be working every day for that 10-week period, but some of that is getting all your registration. That takes some time, and it's going to be about a 15 to 20-page work plan. Then it's going to take about 6 months to actually get the funds. So this is not a quick knock it out on a long weekend kind of grant. So I talked a little bit about customer discovery. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think the two key areas that I like to see my startups focus in on is the value proposition and the customer segment, and knowing that they got a product market fit. We think we've got something here that's solving a problem that we've identified in the marketplace. We've talked to people. Most of these agencies are also going to want you to have letters of support, and you'll get those letters of support as you do those customer discovery and if you can get a partner or a company that says, hey, I'm interested in this, they put it on your letterhead, that would be part of your submission. So this is why it's important to do that customer discovery. So we like to think about this as this product fit. If you haven't done value proposition, this is a really good thing to think about. Does my product idea really fit some of the pains and gains that the customer has? What are the jobs they're trying to do? Who is that customer and why did they buy this? So what's needed for a phase 1 submission? Well, you already set up as a small business. If you've already been registered with the state, that's fine. If you haven't, you don't have to do that. You have to have an address. You have to have a company bank account. And then there's a link here to a tutorial on how to do the registration. This process takes about 6 weeks because you have to wait for one step to the next step to be done. But the first thing you need is an employer identification number. If you're registered for the state, you probably already have that. As of today, you have to go to Duns and Bradstreet and get a DUNS number. But if you wait till April the 3rd, the federal government's going to change this process where you're going to actually get a unique, it's a unique identifier number. I forget what UEI stands for, but it's part of the SAM's registration. So the current process is you have your EIN number. You then go and get a DUNS number, and you take that and put those numbers into the SAM registration process. It's a system for award management. And this is essentially how the government pays anybody that does work with the government. So if you were actually going to be a government contractor and sell to the government, you would do that through SAM. And essentially why they have to have your account is if you get awarded the grant, this is how they actually pay you. So think of this as direct deposit, just similar like you would do with the IRS. But if I were you, if you haven't registered, I'd wait till April 3rd, and then that'll be a lot simpler. They're going to streamline that, where you go into SAM's and it'll actually assign you this UEI that you'll use that in lieu of the DUNS number. I know that could be a little confusing, and I'm happy to answer questions later about that. So then you take all of that and then you go to SBIR.gov, and that's where you actually register. And depending on which agency, you'll have different agency registrations, and most of them use Fastlane, but not all of them use Fastlane. Some of them use ER Commons and other ones to actually submit the grant. Most of it's all done online. So what are your chances of being rewarded? Well, they're always a little behind on this data, a couple of years reporting. But in 2018, 16%, which sounds low, but when you think about it, it's not really a fair comparison, but only about 1% of startups get venture capital. And I know those are mutually exclusive and we really shouldn't compare those, but I still think it's a good way to think about it. And I also wondered, I wish I knew of those 19,000, how many really just didn't even fill out the SBIR correctly? That didn't even get reviewed because they didn't answer all the questions. So it's not a bad chance. And the other cool thing is if you do the phase 1 and they like your work, you have a really high chance of getting a phase 2. So that's a much higher rate, 55% of those that apply for phase 2 because they were phase 1 awardees, past awardees. STTRs have about a similar rate. The process is totally baked into that they want to encourage first-time submitters. So 40% of the awardees typically are first-time submissions, especially with NSF. So here's the range, anywhere from 7% all the way up to 28%. Phase 1 and phase 2 there have those as well. That's the same numbers we just showed you. So in my opinion, it's not bad odds. A lot of it's just doing your homework, and we've got other workshops that we do where we go dive into the details of what a good submission looks like. We don't do that for this kind of webinar. Here, I'm just trying to figure out, is the SBIR a fit for you? So I want to talk a little bit about National Science Foundation, and then we'll wrap up for questions. This is a great option because NSF has very broad topics. So for instance, I mentioned artificial intelligence. There's actual topic on that. And then there's even subtopics within that. And if you don't have a topic, they have a topic called other. And so you don't fit in one of their topics, they want this to be about, this is more about coming it from the submitter's perspective as opposed to the agency's perspective. So this is sort of the federal government saying, come one, come all innovators. We want your ideas. We want to be able to fund commercialization. This is all about commercialization. Obviously, it's got the word science in there, so it's got to be, it's got to be science and technology, but it's really about commercialization. They normally have 4 rolling quarters, but not sure what's going on. But NSF just announced they've got 3 submission windows they've announced for 2022. So those are a little bit different. Generally, they have 4 quarters. But what's nice about that is if you don't make one quarter, you can just wait and do the next quarter. There's no deadline like with some of the other granting agencies where they may only have once a year or twice a year. And if you miss that window, then you're waiting for a whole year. How this works is, and I've got a link to their portfolio with all this. This is actually called the Seed Fund. And what you do is this is by invitation only, and it's done through a project pitch. And what a project pitch is it's 1,500 words. It's a brief description of your concept, what you think you're going to try to accomplish in your research, and what your team look like. They'll typically review this in about 3 weeks. And it's kind of a good way to find out, hey, would this pass muster with the NSF? So once you're selected, then you have a year to submit your full proposal. This is probably our most popular agency that we work with because it's so wide open. And about 1 in 3 project pitches get invited. So anyway, and then I'm going to leave you with some resources. Here's my email address. We're taxpayer funded. We offer no cost counseling, taxpayer funded counseling, other resources. We also have a research arm that does secondary market research analysis. And then we also, there's a link to the tutorials. There's a lot of tutorials on this. The federal government does a great job with creating lots of information for startups. Veronica Redmond, I don't know if you know that name, but she was a post fellow at WashU. Her and I do a workshop 3 times a year, day-and-a-half workshop focused just on NSF. We have a Phase 0 FAST grant that actually is funding that, so no cost to you to participate. And there's a link you can register. It's in May 10th. It's a full day on May 10th and a half day on May 11th. And then BioGenerator is a partner of ours. They do a specific prep workshop focused on NIH, and that's their next one in May. They do those 3 times a year. And we have a number of other training as well, events. That is a link there. So now I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody.
Great. Please feel free to add some more questions as we're going through. But one of the questions, Ed, that we had for you is, you have to be a Phase 1 awardee in order to be considered for Phase 2 for a project.
For the most part, yes. The short answer is yes. NIH, though, does offer an option called a fast track, where you're essentially applying for Phase 1 and Phase 2 at the same time. In order to do that, you better have some really strong data, more than just preliminary data. You probably already are almost essentially completed almost part of your Phase 1 on your own dollar, and now you're asking for the fast track. But for the most part, Phase 1 has to be completed and successfully completed. They have to be happy with your work, and then you would go on to apply for Phase 2.
Okay, great. And some other questions came in the chat. So is SBIR on a rolling basis versus deadline? And how much money do we get? Do we ask for the amount?
I'm not sure I understand that question. What do you mean by stub line?
Linda, do you mind coming off mute and ask that question, please?
Yeah, so do we apply for these and then the review, or is it like the deadline for kind of the NSF where there's like 3 or 4 within the year?
Okay, yeah, basically what NSF is a little bit different. You can apply anytime, but you won't be reviewed until the end of that cycle. So like I showed the dates. I won't pull my screen up again, but I'll just grab the dates. So like, for instance, you're already too late for cycle 1 for this year. So March 4th to June 30th. So if you submit that on, let's say, April 1st, they're not going to review that though until they won't have that review process done until the end of June. Then it'll take about 6 months to actually get the funds. Is that,
Oh,
is
so
that
are they on the same window as the NSF like window that you have, or is SBIR on a different timeline?
okay? SBIR is, think of that as broader. NSF is just one agency within SBIR. So if you go to NIH and look at their solicitations, they're going to be all on a different time frame, and each one will be it may be a different. They may not have 4 cycles a year. They may only have 1 a year. Like DoD typically only has, you got to get it that one time, and then you got to wait till the following year to submit. Am I answering the question, Linda? I want to make sure I'm.
Yeah, I think so. So they do have like certain more rigid deadlines throughout the year, or
Yes.
it won't be
Yes.
reviewed. It's not like a rolling basis when you apply. They're like, oh, a new one comes in.
Yes. So NSF's the only one that has that rolling cycle. All the other agencies have very specific deadlines for each of those, and you can't. And you all. The other thing that we kind of in our more advanced tips is if you're going to submit it, we tell people submit it like at least 3 days before the deadline, because everybody's on this system, right? Online system, and it can get wonky. And if your thing doesn't get if you don't get a receipt back says we received your submission, and you're 1 hour later, you missed the window, and you might have to wait a whole year. So we always tell people, get in there early. So.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Ed, we have another question. So
Sure.
how can graduate students, postdocs be paid off of these grants?
Well, you could do a couple ways. One, you could do an STTR with WashU, and you're going to have to talk to your tech transfer about how you do that exactly. But you could even do it. I think you could even do an STTR on your own concept, but you're doing it with WashU. Or you could be leveraging a technology that WashU owns a patent on. But if you wanted to do an SBIR, you could do that, but you'd have to take a sabbatical from your position. You would not be able to do that. The other option, there's lots of options though. The other option is if you're working with another startup, another individual that's also involved with the startup, they could hire you as a consultant, and you wouldn't have to leave your full-time job. But you would still have to show that you can dedicate, whatever the consulting arrangement is, you would have to show that, and that would be detailed in the submission. So there's a couple different options. I'm happy to kind of counsel that on a one-on-one basis if there's a specific thing that somebody wants to ask later at a future date.
So and pretty much you're saying that if we get these grants, we need to be on it full time.
Yeah, for the most part, you really need to be on it full time, unless it's an STTR where you're doing it as part of the university.
Thank you.
We have some more questions, Ed. So can a conflict arise between a student's training goals versus them collecting data to be used in the formation of a company?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I don't know if I know the answer to that one. Can you say that again and clarify what you mean by?
Yeah, I could jump in and clarify this with my question. I was thinking of it from the point of view of I'm a PI at WashU. If a proposal was funded that included money for a student, how does that work with the student? Because they have academic goals and things that may not always align with the goals of the SBIR.
That's an interesting question. I think that you would probably only get to pay them out of the grant for the work that they're doing toward that grant. So let's say they've got, I'm just making this up, let's say they've got 3 responsibilities, but only 2 of those relate to your SBIR or STTR, and probably in this case, then you'd only be able to use those, pay them out of those 2. The other thing would have to probably be paid out of some other budget.
Okay.
I mean, that's an oversimplified answer. I mean, the specifics of that would have to be, but you should have somebody within your tech transfer or what do you call those? Operational something. Every university has a different name for them, but they're the ones that kind of coordinate, and they can kind of tell you the rules of where the grant money can be used and can't be used. And I would say, ask twice, spend once.
Cool.
Kind of the measure twice, cut once. Ask twice, spend once, because that gets you in trouble. So
cool. Thank you.
Mhm.
And another question.
It's not unusual. Like, I actually have a startup that's going to work with the University of Missouri professor, and they're going to hire grad students as part of this project, but they're doing an STTR. Okay. And then the university is the professor, what they're getting out of it is they're going to publish this. So now, as a startup, you have to be cautious with that, because if they're going to publish your data, well, guess what? This is out in the public. So now there's IP implications to that. There's also competitive implications to that. So that's where you really got to step back and ask yourself, should I do an SBIR or should I do STTR? In some cases, there are startups that don't have the technical knowledge. They have to partner with a professor who has that expertise, and they don't have much choice. And the professor is saying, I'm not going to take a sabbatical. So I know I'm getting into some of the weeds, but that's the kind of thing you have to really just kind of step back and say, what's possible, and then what's also within the rules of the university. But the other piece is, for you also have to be careful. Is this your idea, or does the university own this idea? And I think this is where your OTM office can counsel you on that too. That gets a little sticky as well. Because as a startup, some of my startups, they're trying to work with a professor, and I'm telling them, you better be really clear about who owns what, because during this process of this grant or this project, there's going to be discoveries that may come out of this, and everybody's going to say, well, of course, the university is going to say, well, we own it. Well, the startup's like, well, yeah, but I thought I owned it. So you have to kind of have some of that kind of laid out. The good news is you don't have to have that all final when you go do your grant submission. You would just do that and that's why part of that process of getting that 6 months to get the money, they would tell you, hey, you're going to win this award, even though you haven't got the money yet. So you would have time to kind of work out the details. But I think I always tell people, both parties go in with eyes wide open and say, hey, this is our expectation. So as a professor, I might say, hey, I want to make sure you understand I'm going to publish this, right? And now there might be some agreement of what we publish. We may not publish down to the little detail, the secret sauce. And so that has to be all ironed out. And then also, who owns what that comes out of this development. So I'm frankly just learning that myself with working with startups and working with universities. So it's just, be ready to negotiate, and it's all negotiable though. Good questions.
Yeah, we have another question.
You guys got me on my toes here. I'm getting nervous now.
So does a business have to be producing an active product? For example, if I only have an idea at the moment with very little actual experimentation, should I go ahead and register a business even if I don't have anything yet to sell?
Okay, so when you say register the business, do they mean are you talking about just starting a business, or are you talking about specifically SBIR? Because I feel like those are two different things.
Basically, I'm just unclear on how I should start a business if I don't have anything to interact with, like commerce.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we actually have, the simple answer is we actually have a 90-minute webinar that goes through that. So I'm happy to send that to Cyril, and he can share that. It's just kind of it's a real basic thing about should you incorporate, all that kind of stuff. Maybe that's what you're asking for. And then we also offer other courses around business, customer discovery and helping you think through your concept. But yeah, I work with people who just have literally an idea on a napkin, all the way to, someone that's already got almost a working prototype. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I spent 25 years in what we used to call the fuzzy front end. So you got to start somewhere. And yeah, many ideas. Just don't go out and try to get investors. That's what I have to get. I have some startups that think I got this great idea and they have a PowerPoint deck and they want to go out and get investors. I'm like, you're not ready for investors. You're just trying to figure out what's this idea. And at best, you might get is family, fools, and friends, we like to call them. So even angels want you to have a prototype.
Great. We have another question, Ed. How does the Small Business Administration define small business concern for the purpose of the SBIR program?
Under 500 employees.
Okay.
But it has to be U.S., at least 51% U.S. owned, and all the R&D. This is probably the biggest challenge, especially when you get into the IT space, because a lot of IT is done in places like India, other parts of Asia. And so you can't have your person writing code in India. They have to do it here.
Okay, thank you. And another question is, will innovations that have been patented or have patents pending be considered under SBIR?
Oh, yeah. And actually, part of the submission will be what's your IP strategy. So the fact that you already have a patent will actually increase your chances of being awarded greatly.
And
or I'm sorry. Also, if you're leveraging a patent that the university has, doesn't have to be your patent. That's in other words. Obviously, university has to give you permission to do that, and we're assuming you're going through that process with the OTM. So anyway, sorry. I used to hang out with lawyers a lot, so I'm always careful what I say.
So
it's
Ed,
better
I
to be safe.
have a question. So if you already have a patent, then my understanding of phase one is like you don't have anything, you just have an idea. But if you already have a patent, you must be pretty far along.
Not necessarily. I have a gentleman that has a provisional patent. I can't tell you what it is, but he hasn't even invented it yet.
Okay, so it's provisional. Okay, got it.
Usually it's a provisional patent. Now, here's the other thing that could happen, Linda, is I could take a patent that WashU has for, I don't know, I'm embarrassed to even make up something because you guys all laugh. My 1 year of high school chemistry. But let's say the university has a patent for a particular product that's in market, but you found a new application for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yeah, there's a patent that somebody else owns. You're going to license it from the university to go do something else, even though the patent might be used for something else. So there could be other reasons why their patent already been issued, but typically a provisional patent, all I got to do is come up with a drawing or a description. It has to be very detailed, but I can get a provisional patent done. But you don't have to have that. I just think it adds weight to the submission. What typically happens is I've already got counsel on IP, and I've already got a strategy in place. And I know that if I invent this, if I make this breakthrough, then I'm going to immediately run to the patent office and file, right? So that's what they want you to be able that you've thought through that. But it's not just that. You also should be doing patent search to make sure that your idea doesn't violate another patent. That's actually the harder part, which is because like for instance, during COVID, I had a bunch of people wanting to do stuff with UV light. Well, UV light is already being used and it's been around for a long time. So you may need to find out who has the patent on that and figure out. Now, you don't necessarily have to have a deal signed with them and an agreement, but you would have to articulate that and say, I know that this patent, there's already a patent on this UV, and I suspect I will have to license that. So essentially, you're just telling them, I thought through at least a potential strategy on how I'm going to handle IP. But Veronica and I cover that a lot more detail in the NSF workshop, if you're interested.
Okay.
And she's better at that than I am. So.
Which workshop is this at?
It's the NSF We call it an NSF SBIR interactive workshop, May 10th and 11th, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
And there's a link in the deck that Cyril's going to be sending out that you can register.
Thank you.
Normally charge $99, but we have a grant to cover that.
So it's free for us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, we never say free. It's taxpayer funded.
Yes, yes.
No cost to
We'll check
you.
into it.
Because my salary is taxpayer funded. You know, I'm not charging you all here, but taxpayers paying me to be here.
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for being here, Ed.
Sure.
And just to kind of go over what Ed just said, please send me an email. Afterwards, I'll drop my email in the chat now so you can request the presentation and I can share that with you. So I just dropped my email in the chat. And Ed, we have our last question. Maybe you can expound a little bit on that is, what is the fast track mechanism and how does it work?
Okay, the fast track is specifically to National Institute of Health. So let's say you've already done, actually have a client who already kind of proven something in a test tube. And I'll say kind of proved because he probably doesn't have, you know, he hasn't done any kind of double blind study and all that. So he's got enough data that he feels confident that his phase one, he could go right from phase 1 to phase 2. Now he still has to complete, you're essentially applying for 2 grants in one. So you're saying, I'm going to do phase 1 and I'm going to do phase 2. They approve you for both of them. But you have to have, I think, enough data to support that you have a high likelihood that your phase 1 is going to go well.
And the one last question came in, Ed. Sorry about that. I keep saying last question.
Oh, that's fine. We got time.
Yep. So if anyone has questions, please keep sending them through the chat. You can either send it to me private message on the chat or drop it in the main chat, and I can ask Ed that. Or Phil, please feel free also to come off mute and ask if it happens to you. So Ed, the question is, are nonprofit concerns eligible for SBIR awards? And if not, why?
Because this is about creating jobs and it's commercialization. So nonprofits are not. Now, nonprofits, there are other grants out there, but they're not SBIRs. So nonprofits cannot apply.
Thank you. Do we have any open questions in the, can you apply for both SBIR and STTR?
It's a yes and a no. Usually what we do is we counsel you to talk to the program director and get some advice about that. We can help you counsel with that, but a lot of times the program director might be able to help you if you're right on the fence. And that's assumed, but you really wouldn't apply for both of them. You would pick one or the other. Because essentially they're really the same grant. So if you go into the SBIR.gov and look at some of the solicitations, you'll actually see where it'll be like, and sometimes it'll put it all in one. Sometimes they'll divide it into 2, but the grants are really written exactly the same. They're the same aims, they're the same project. The only difference is one is using a federal institute or a university research institute, or the other is not, you know, and there are different rules about that. The other thing is, keep in mind, not all agencies offer both options. So it depends on what agency you're going to go after.
And Ed, I have my personal question is, say for example, you can't meet with the Skindler Center. How can I connect, or how can I go through the value proposition canvas? Do you offer such resources? Yeah.
My email is in the presentation. What we would do is we would set you up. You have to officially, even though it's no cost taxpayer funded, you have to officially request it. Takes about 2 minutes to fill out an online form, and And then we'll reach out to you and set up a one-on-one time, or we can also direct you to different training events. I also included a link to all our training events as well. In addition to myself, we've got other training events that happen in Kansas City. Most of these all are we're going to probably keep a lot of these on Zoom. So anybody in Missouri is welcome to attend those. You don't have to be like, if you're in St. Louis and you can't make a St. Louis event, there's a Kansas City event, you can do that as well. Or you can attend both.